The Hope Chest, Chapter 19, Freedom. They took the streetcar out to the auto camp. The seats were all full and they had to stand. They didn't care. It seemed like nothing in the world could ever make them unhappy again. The city had built the campground to accommodate the new sport of auto camping, which had become so popular these last few years. Motorists could pitch their tents in the camps for free and stay as long as they wanted. Everyone was traveling all over America, at least everyone who could afford an automobile and some gasoline, and people said it was just like the old covered wagon days, only faster. But not much faster because the roads were so bad. Chloe and Violet walked to a tent at the back that had been turned around so that its door faced away from the rest of the campground, to keep Mr. Martin better hidden, Violet guessed. But Mr. Martin was kneeling on the ground outside the tent, tending a fire. Myrtle stood beside him, clutching his shoulder possessively. "There you are!" He jumped up and hugged Chloe, then reddened and stepped back. "I heard already. We won!" "Theo, what have you done to your face?" Chloe demanded. Violet thought his face looked rather bruised and battered, and he had a black eye. He had also been given a terrible haircut, it looked like, with a pocket knife. But Mr. Martin touched his scar. "I'm not wearing that stuff." "You washed it off," Chloe accused. "Theo, you have to wear it, and stop washing it off. I paid 50 cents for the bottle." Chloe ducked into the tent and emerged a minute later holding a small glass bottle. "I am not wearing Lady Janice liquid face powder," Mr. Martin said firmly. "You have to wear it," said Myrtle. "Miss Chloe sold her car to get you out of jail, so paint your scar and stay out of jail." She took the bottle from Chloe and handed it to Mr. Martin. "You sold your car?" said Mr. Martin. Chloe nodded. "You shouldn't have done that." "To get you out of 20 years in Fort Leavenworth? Sure, I should have." Mr. Martin silently sat down on a log and let Chloe dab Lady Janice liquid face powder over his scar, his bruises, and his black eye. Myrtle and Violet watched with interest. The stuff was a little bit lighter than Mr. Martin's face, but darker than the scar. Once Chloe put on several coats, you couldn't see the scar if you looked at him from a distance. Or you probably wouldn't if you didn't already know the scar was there, Violet thought. And on a darker day, maybe. "Now we'll celebrate," Mr. Martin said. "You ladies are about to taste the finest of Hungarian dishes, Rakott Krumpli and Ziegenrüspeck. Nothing else is good enough to celebrate the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. At least, nothing that is legal in these abstemious times." He reached into the tent and brought out a paper sack, from which he began pulling out potatoes, onions, eggs, a cut of bacon, and a paper twist of spices. "Theo, you went grocery shopping?" Chloe said in dismay. "Anyone could have seen you." "I only went to the camp store," said Mr. Martin with a shrug. He pulled out his pocket knife, which Myrtle had returned to him, and began peeling potatoes. "You're hopeless," said Chloe, sitting down beside him and taking a knife from her handbag. "We have to get you out of the country quickly." Although it was still sunny, a shadow seemed to have fallen over the campsite. They all drew closer to the fire, as if for warmth. Although it was a hot day, there was silence for a moment. "I was thinking about Argentina," said Mr. Martin dismally, slicing into a potato. "They say it's very nice there." "Do you speak Spanish?" Violet asked. "No," said Theo. He set a naked potato on the toe of his boot and sliced it in half. "I've been meaning to learn." "What about Alaska?" said Chloe. Mr. Martin looked at her in surprise. "Why would I go to Alaska?" "Because Alaska gave women the vote as its very first territorial act," said Chloe, "and because it is a territory, not a state, and they hardly have any laws there. And it's about 5,000 miles away from Attorney General Palmer and his friend J. Edgar Hoover and their agents. And there are plenty of people there who have found it convenient to change their names." "You seem to know a lot about Alaska," said Mr. Martin with a depressed-looking smile. "She's wanted to go there all her life," Violet put in. She remembered the picture Chloe had drawn for her of an Eskimo driving a dog sled. Mr. Martin picked up another potato and studied it thoughtfully. He looked at Chloe quickly and then back at the potato. "Do you want to go there? He stopped at a loss for words and stared at the potato. "Do you want to go there with him, Miss Chloe?" Myrtle finished firmly. Say yes. Excuse me, said Violet, jumping in. I have to use the... She stumbled blindly away from the campsite. She didn't have to use anything. She wandered between an auto tent set up against the side of a pan touring car and a red and white striped tent that smelled strongly of mildew. She accidentally walked into the midst of a family sitting on the ground eating liverwurst sandwiches and pickles. She knew it was dumb of her, but she'd just assumed Chloe would be going back to New York. She had gone on thinking that Chloe would let Violet live with her, even though Chloe had changed the subject every time she'd brought it up. She hadn't thought that Chloe, independent Chloe, who had spent her hope chest money on a car and called it her freedom, would ever get married. Well, lots of people said they never wanted to get married, and then they went and got married just the same. But they didn't go to Alaska when they did it. Violet wandered over to the bathroom. It had real toilets and running water. She wandered on and found a kitchen house with real stoves in it. All this for free, Violet thought. They shouldn't have wasted their money in the hotel. But she supposed it had been the National Women's Party's money. Chloe, Violet realized, had just come to the end of a long battle. Violet had cared about women winning the vote for the last week or so, ever since she met the woman waiting for her son's coffin in Chattanooga. And these last few days it had meant a great deal to her. But she hadn't fought for it like Chloe had. That Chloe would want to move on to something else now was normal, she supposed. That Mr. Martin should be the something else she wanted to move on to was, well, probably also normal. Only to be expected, really. Mother and father would be absolutely furious. Violet smiled. That was some consolation. Furious wasn't even the word for it. They had wanted Chloe to marry a Mr. R, not a one-eyed, seven-fingered Bolshevik who was on the run from the law and kept changing his name. By the time she got back to the campsite, Chloe and Mr. Martin were standing side by side with their arms around each other, and Chloe's spare arm was around Myrtle. I've always wanted to go to Alaska too, Myrtle was saying. Violet decided to ignore all this. There's a kitchen over there with stoves, she said. You don't need to use the campfire. But we have to have a campfire or we're not really camping, Mr. Martin said enthusiastically. He disentangled himself from Chloe long enough to flip the bacon in the frying pan resting in the flames. In Alaska, we'll cook like this all the time. No stoves in Alaska. It's very cold there, Violet reminded him. Most of the year it's all snow and ice. And dog sleds, Chloe said, and mountains. She patted Myrtle on the head. We'll have to wrap Myrtle up in a caribou parka to keep her warm. Violet burned with jealousy. She knew that she had a home to go back to. She didn't want to go back to it, but she could, and Myrtle didn't. She knew that Mr. Martin had to leave the country or go to jail, but it wasn't fair. She had brought all of them together, found Chloe for Mr. Martin, and for Myrtle, and Myrtle and Mr. Martin for Chloe. That the three of them should all go off to Alaska and leave her was completely unfair. I want to go to Alaska too, Violet said. The three of them looked at her. Their faces were all sad, as if they all knew she wasn't going to Alaska. Let's eat, said Mr. Martin. They ate off 10 plates, which, like the tent, Chloe had because she'd done a lot of camping during her travels from state to state over the last year. Violet had to admit that the stuff Mr. Martin had cooked was good, whatever it was called. It certainly didn't look like any of the things he'd put into it. How did you two meet each other? Myrtle asked. Chloe looked at Mr. Martin adoringly. He hit me on the head with the shovel, she said. I did not. Mr. Martin dropped his fork and tried to look annoyed, but ruined it by looking adoring at the same time. You walked into me. I was just carrying a shovel at the same time. Why were you carrying a shovel? Myrtle asked. Mr. Martin and Chloe both looked suddenly solemn. I know, said Violet. It was during the influenza. She was coming home from seeing influenza patients, and he was coming home from digging graves for them. Suddenly, Violet felt that she couldn't wait to be grown up and allowed to work all day and into the night, if she wanted, on something that mattered. Not taking care of sick people, necessarily, and definitely not digging graves, but some important work that needed doing. She wanted to feel again the way she'd felt this last week in Nashville. that what she was doing was going to make a difference to somebody. The way she felt when her class knitted blankets for French orphans. She thought about what Chloe had said, that college armed you to fight the great battles. She thought she knew what battle she needed to be armed for. She wanted to fight against the laws that put Myrtle in a separate train car and kept her out of hotels and away from drugstore lunch counters. Remembering the flat expressions on the faces of the desk clerks and the conductor, she realized that was a battle that could last a lifetime. And she knew, just as well as Chloe and Myrtle and Mr. Martin knew, that she wasn't going to Alaska. A week later, Violet sat alone on a fence in front of the auto camp. She was waiting for some of the National Women's Party ladies from New York who had driven a big Packard motor car to Tennessee. Violet was going to ride back with them, auto camping the whole way. Auto camping was America's most popular new sport, but Mother and Father had always said that it was unsuitable for ladies, and that one met entirely the wrong sort of people while auto camping. Violet hoped this was true. She expected she might like the wrong sort of people just fine. It would be an exciting trip, and Violet would be in charge of taking notes on the condition of the roads, which the ladies could then report to their automobile club and to the newspapers back home. The only bad thing about the trip was that there was a serious risk Violet might get back to Susquehanna in time to start school. And Mr. Martin, Hanover, our Podfee, and Chloe had gotten married under the name of Hanover, which Violet was a little worried about because she wasn't sure it counted. They had gotten a justice of the peace in another county to marry them, a county where Mr. Martin had not been in jail and wouldn't be recognized. Getting married seemed to be the one occasion in Tennessee when it was all right to have white and colored people in a room at the same time, and nobody tried to chase Myrtle out. It had been a very brief ceremony, because when the judge asked Chloe if she promised to love, honor, and obey Mr. Martin, Chloe had said, "Obey him? What is that doing in there? I certainly don't." "Yes, really, that's a bit archaic," Mr. Martin had said. "She's not my dog, you know. Don't you have a more modern marriage ceremony in there that you could do?" He reached politely for the book the judge was holding. Do you two want to get married or not?" the judge demanded. "Yes, of course," said Chloe. And Mr. Martin said, "That's what we're here for." "Fine. I now pronounce you man and wife," said the judge, slamming his book shut. "Why not woman and husband?" said Chloe. "I was already a man when I came in here," said Mr. Martin. But the judge was through with them. The Antis had tried for several days to get the Tennessee House to overturn their ratification of the 19th Amendment, but instead, the House voted and passed the amendment again. Then Governor Roberts signed the ratification and sent it by express to Secretary of State Colby in Washington, while the Antis kept sputtering and objecting and filing lawsuits. Meanwhile, Chloe and Mr. Martin, Hanover, found someone who could give them and Myrtle a ride to Chicago. From there, they would figure out a way to get to Seattle with Myrtle. Seattle was where ships for Alaska sailed from. "But isn't that jumping bail?" Violet asked. "Doesn't Mr. Hanover have a court date or something?" "Please call me Theo," said Mr. Well, all right, Theo, Violet decided. "According to what my wife tells me, I'm not out on bail." "He's not?" said Violet to Chloe. Said Chloe happily. "Myrtle introduced me to a gentleman named Mr. Ezekiel, who she said knew a lot about bribes. Well, not a gentleman exactly, but a suff legislator. He knew exactly how to go about it. But I had to sell the hope chest to pay the bribe, which means I did use the money Granny Mayhew left me to get married after all," Chloe said with a sigh. "Just like Granny meant me to." "I doubt your Granny meant for you to spend it on a bribe to get your fella out of jail," said Theo comfortingly. Chloe brightened. "That's true, and I did make a lot of miles in the hope chest." "You have an education to get, Violet," Chloe had told her before they'd left for Chicago. "You need high school, but don't take the domestic science program. Take sciences or academic, whichever you prefer. And then college. Remember what I said. College arms you to fight the great battles." "And how am I supposed to get Father and Mother to agree to all that?" Violet said. "Insist," said Chloe. It won't cost them anything. There's your hope chest money. 2 weeks ago, Violet would have replied that it was no good insisting with Father, who seldom even spoke to her, or with Mother, who had no opinions except Father's. She would have said that the hope chest money might be hers in theory, but in reality it was tied up to a future she dreaded. But now she knew what it was like to stand your ground. She knew what it was like to keep on when things seemed hopeless. And she knew that with patience and hard work, a radical, ridiculed idea, like women voting, could become as acceptable and ordinary as oatmeal.